Plugged in, how will Asia's digital innovation impact on New Zealand's businesses? Kia ora katoa katoa, naumai hairamai, hithe kura umanga. Kia ora everyone. My name is Chris Vass, the Director of the MBA and Industry Programs at the UC Business School at the University of Canterbury. As your facilitator and moderator for this evening, it gives me great pleasure to extend a very warm welcome to each and every one of you on behalf of the University and the Business School, especially to the first of this HEECO Focus on Asia webinar series. I know we have participants tuning in from New Zealand, Australia, Singapore, Indonesia, Malaysia, Vietnam, and elsewhere. It is great, extremely great to have you join us. So as you might gather, the purpose of these discussions is to explore some of the latest and emerging developments happening in the Asian context. And we might look potentially at, take a closer look at some of the ASEAN nations and see what exactly is transpiring in that context. These discussions are intended to help businesses, but also help each and every one of us think about how we might navigate an evolving future that's taking shape in Asia and what we might be able to do in the New Zealand context. So no doubt this evening's discussion around Asia's digital innovation is going to provide us with much fodder and give us room to think about, how businesses might shape some of its tactics going forward, but also our own journey within organizations. But before we get there, I'd like to invite Simon Draper, the Executive Director of Asia New Zealand Foundation, to extend his welcome. And we at the UC Business School are extremely privileged and honored to be partnering with the Asia New Zealand Foundation on this first webinar series. Simon, over to you.
Thanks very much, Chris, and a very warm welcome to everyone watching from a rather cold and windy Wellington. Look, the Asia New Zealand Foundation is really pleased to be partnering with UC Business School in this webinar series, and it is a series, and it represents to us our commitment to the South Island, in fact, because we are just opening, after 25 years, a permanent presence in the South Island, and Alistair Crozier will be leading that engagement down there in the mainland. The role of the foundation, what we're here to do is to equip New Zealanders with the knowledge, the networks and the confidence to thrive in Asia. So having these three expert panelists who I will consider friends of the Asia New Zealand Foundation, and even one of my bosses here with Mitchell, it's great to have you all here participating and we are very grateful. Thank you also, Chris, for agreeing to moderate this and for the work that's gone on behind the scenes. Look, what we know is that Asia is going to be important. Not just important, probably the key to New Zealand's economic recovery from COVID. COVID hasn't fundamentally changed anything, it's just sped everything up. And what's clear to us is as Asia is going to be a key part of New Zealand's recovery, so is digital. Digital is going to be crucial. So like others, I'm really looking forward to hearing what our experts have got to say today, and thanks again for the opportunity to participate. Thank you very much. Back to you, Chris.
Thank you, Simon. I couldn't agree with you more in terms of the knowledge and networks that we have to build from our business perspectives and our individual perspectives. And also very importantly, obviously, with the globe and the pandemic that's impacted us, I think the good side or the pros of the pandemic is that it's heightened the focus we placed on digital. I mean, I can talk from a university perspective, what that's done to our business model and reshaped us in that context. But let's not wait any further to get into the discussion. As you've said, we've got an expert panelist to take us through some of these challenges and talk to us through some of these opportunities and what might be possible for New Zealand. So let me introduce the panelists to the audience. So we've got Susan Chen, the Senior Vice President, Global Head of Leadership and Talent Development, Gojek in Indonesia. Welcome, Susan. Mitchell Pham, the Chief Sales and Marketing Officer from the Augen Software Group. Great to have you with us, Mitchell. And Stephanie Honey, the Director of Honey Consulting, amongst the various hats she wears. A very warm welcome to you as well, Stephanie. So if I might start off with Susan, give us the 2-minute elevator pitch on Susan Chen and how you relate to the topic tonight.
Sure. Hi, everyone, and great to be here. I'm based in Singapore right now, but I'm a proud Kiwi living around the globe. I've been in Asia for the last 12 years. I was in Europe before, and I just couldn't get enough of Asia, right? I think it has expanded, has changed so much in the different parts of Asia. And I've been sort of involved in growth, startup, and transformation in the last sort of 6 years within sort of health tech space, fintech, food and lifestyle, and transport tech as well. So I will love to share some more insight with you a little bit later on, and great to be here. Thank you for having me.
Fantastic, Susan. Thanks for being with us tonight. Mitchell, tell us about yourself, apart from being Simon's boss.
He always says that. Well, good evening in New Zealand, at least, everyone. So I have been a tech entrepreneur in New Zealand for 27 years, and the same in Vietnam for 16 years. And all that time, I've been very fortunate to be working with mostly new innovation. So the Augen software group is a specialist in software development and integration. And so most of what we do for businesses and for other tech companies are very much in the new innovation space, and also connecting new innovation back into kind of legacy systems. And so that's been kind of a very, very colorful domain to work across, particularly in different industries such as financial services and healthcare and transport logistics and so forth. What's really fascinating for me is how diverse New Zealand businesses are, and how different businesses innovate when it comes to digital and tech. I've also been involved with the technology industry as well, in a number of industry groups. And I also advise, I'm on a number of government advisory boards as well. I've always had a very strong interest in Asia, particularly Southeast Asia, because that's where I'm originally from, and having expanded New Zealand business into as well. And so I'm hoping to be able to share some insights in this evening's event, and also look forward to hearing and learning from our other speakers tonight as well.
Fantastic. Thanks, Mitchell. I'm sure we're going to get a lot out of you as far as talking about business expansion opportunities. How do we leverage some of the diversity that we're seeing in New Zealand businesses and make it, try and create a competitive advantage out of that. But we'll hold off on that discussion. Stephanie, you've worked far and wide. Tell us the story of Stephanie Honey and how you connect with the topic tonight.
Well, thanks very much, Chris, and kia ora koutou, everybody. It's really fantastic to have the opportunity to be part of this conversation, and particularly exciting because it's about the digital economy, which, you know, is just the most fascinating and dynamic part of modern trade policy. So I'm a trade policy consultant. I was formerly a trade negotiator for the New Zealand government. And as you mentioned, I wear a lot of hats these days. So some of the roles that I have are as the policy advisor to the New Zealand members of the Apec Business Advisory Council. I'm the associate director of the New Zealand International Business Forum. I'm the senior trade policy manager for Beef and Lamb New Zealand. I co-founded a business that teaches trade policy. So I wear lots of hats, but I'm speaking tonight in my personal capacity. And I'm, you know, thrilled to be here because when I started out in trade, it was in the very sort of traditional sectors, agriculture and you know, the sort of rather analog model of exporting. But I've spent a lot of time over the last few years working around the Asia Pacific and working on digital trade issues. And I'm excited by it because I think it has huge potential to advance the interests of New Zealand business and the New Zealand community, society. It's, you know, really gets rid of that sort of tyranny of distance that's been our trade policy story for so long, and creates new opportunities for small businesses, for women, for Māori, all of the groups that I'm very sort of passionate about helping. So it's a thrill to be here tonight. It's a great chance to have an interesting conversation about something that, as you mentioned, Chris, could not be more topical with COVID as well. So thanks for the opportunity to be here, and thanks to Simon and the Asia New Zealand Foundation for running this great series of seminars.
Thanks for that, Stephanie. A wealth of experience, and you might be our voice back into government following tonight's conversation. So no pressure yet. Let's see how we go. It's a great introduction. So I might just also mention my engagement with this particular topic and this particular landscape. So I've been in New Zealand now 2 years. Prior to this, I was in Singapore for a few years, and prior to that in Australia, working in government and in academia as well. So I've looked at industry from multiple perspectives, looked at the Asia Pacific context in that regard as well. But earlier this year, along with a team of academics here at the University of Canterbury, the business school, we undertook a study looking at digital maturity and digital resilience in Australian, New Zealand organizations. So largely we collected data from around 300 firms and organizations across Australia and New Zealand, and a large data set from small and medium enterprise as well, just to understand in the context of agility, the words that are often used now is agility, pivot, resilience, trying to understand how New Zealand businesses, Australian businesses are adapting to new technology. Obviously, we've researched quite a bit. We've published a piece in the Institute of Directors Boardroom magazine as well, talking about the importance of leadership in that context of driving digital capability within the firm. And obviously, as Simon mentioned earlier, COVID has been that catalyst as far as digital transformation and the curve that many of the organizations have now embarked upon. But Susan, coming back to the context of Asia and how businesses are responding to digital and digital transformation, what are you seeing in that region over there, and how are businesses starting to use technology as a leverage point to either innovate products or services, and what else are they doing in that context?
Good question. And I think if we start with conceptualizing Asia, is that Asia is big, but is very different, right? So I usually say, let's put it in the context that if we think about two parts, of course, we can break it down even more, but there is sort of the mature Asia where, we're looking at places like Singapore as an example of mature Asia, which generally has much higher digital maturity, saturation, and resilience and knowledge, right? So that's mature Asia. And then you have emerging Asia, which is, you have patches of in terms of maturity, understanding, and how they leverage within the business. So if I think about these two contexts, right, what we're observing in mature Asia is still this kind of talking about or thinking about deep and complex innovation. So what does that mean? I think it's about focusing on changing consumer behavior and readapting that as a business-oriented growth. So we're seeing this in edutech, in even HR techs, insurance tech, payments, for example. It's really moving really fast into the point that we're thinking about things like blockchain, privacy, how does data can pivot for business use and revenue stream. Which in contrast, in sort of emerging Asia, what I'm seeing is that it's much more what I consider as inclusion and impact innovation. So the innovation is much more thinking about how do we think about social and economic inclusion. For instance, how do we think about the unbanked, getting them banked through the payment network, and thinking about the network in a very different way as what a mature Asia would do. Right, and the merchant, the food, for instance, the food landscape we compare to the mature Asia, which is a lot more around convenience, which had grown rapidly with COVID, right? People can't leave the house. It becomes an essential requirement for them to pivot in the mature market to say, you need to bring the food to the house. Where emerging Asia, even though their convenience point is still there, but we see a lot more conversation around inclusion, right? How do we start including home businesses? Woman who is cooking wonderful meals at home, but they weren't able to turn that into a commercial engagement through this kind of technology that allows women, for example, as one population that can start engaging in economic activities they may not be able to do before. Right. So emerging Asia, I think, continue to think about that different engagement model compared to the mature Asia. But I think what's really interesting with COVID and what I'm observing right now compared to maybe 2 years ago is this convergence. The convergence of where a lot of organizations operating in mature Asia is starting to think about what does that mean in emerging Asia, right? And then vice versa. So before, if you look at some of the transport and food technology, say from Uber, which I think New Zealand are very well aware of, and how they operate in the mature market. US, New Zealand will be very different. What they have learned is how they need to behave in countries like Indonesia, Thailand, and Vietnam, right, as an example. And if we think about conversions, it's not just from this consumer and product point of view. I'm also observing from an investor perspective. It's really interesting that you start seeing sort of a mature emerging Asia, such as China as a big player, start investing in say fintech in Australia and New Zealand, which 2 years ago is not very common, right? There's a lot of sort of mature Asia or emerging Asia money previously in countries like Indonesia, and also Thailand, Vietnam continues to be. We see a lot of investor interest. But what's really interesting, I'm starting to see a lot more of that interest moving into places like Australia and New Zealand as well. So I think I'm seeing New Zealand possibilities. How does New Zealand become a bridge in this world? I think New Zealand has this beautiful balance of not really being fully just mature or fully just emerging. I think we have this beautiful opportunity to take both and think about inclusion impact within the New Zealand context, but also the mature context from, for example, technology and talent. So these are, I think some of the things that we start seeing moving, which is much more of that converging point of view compared to before. And I think absolutely COVID has speed things up and the conversation more and more. I think coming from my background of sort of both into the business expansion on the startup side, but also on the people side, right? The talent and leadership development. What I'm seeing is that COVID has opened a brand new world conversation around talent. How can we get more New Zealand talent exposure and experiences into Asia? I think now that conversation is becoming even more, even more, the world possibility has opened because COVID, because now people understand you can have people working and living around different parts of the world and really come together, right? So that convergence of talent, I think it's speeding up a lot more, where previously there's still certain sense of barrier to say how that can actually work. So I'm gonna pause here. That's my kind of rant of what I'm seeing around what's happening right now. I can go on and on, but I'm gonna stop.
Yeah, no, I think there's clearly a lot in there. I want to come to the topic of obviously how does New Zealand participate and engage in this these developments in Asia. Before I get to that, I just wanted to probe you a little further, Susan, in terms of looking at, you know, what are the demand drivers for some of these changes that are happening. So is it consumer led? Is it, you know, product or service innovation led? You mentioned investor appetite is probably changing towards, you know, just product and service, just to more, you know, looking at impact, particularly given the scale in Asia. And obviously the other side of all of this, when you talk about technology, data, AI, blockchain, and all of that, you start to think about business model, you think about platform ecosystems. So in your, you know, experience living and engaged in the Singapore context, but also in the wider ASEAN and the Asia context, what do you think are the demand drivers? Because when I think about, you know, how New Zealand businesses can participate, for a very long time, I mean, I spent a lot of time working in government in Canberra, and there was a lot of rhetoric around, you know, the Asian century. It was like, it's like there's this thing happening in Asia, and that, you know, all the Aussies need to flock there because we just want to take advantage of it. And the other, you know, myth that, and the common misconception is, you know, Asia is this one big basket, everything is the same. Well, it's not. So trying to, you know, just disaggregate some of those issues around demand drivers, you know, what is it that's, you know, forcing businesses and innovation at the different scales?
Yeah, no, really good question. And I'm sort of reflecting on what I've seen in the past few years, and also much more in the startup context. I think usually at the start of the sort of, whether that's product innovation or technology innovation in a sort of startup sense, is usually consumer sort of led, right? There is a consumer need in the market. They find ways to solve that, and then you see startups or organizations grow bigger and bigger, and they start to be a little bit more than investor led, right? Your investor will say, what are your opportunities, or where are you going to be invested in to go into this part of the region, or these are the product you need to focus on. And then I see, as as that road continue to open, then you start seeing a bit more technology leverage to say, okay, but what is actually possible with the ability or the availability of your innovation and technology? But of course, when you look at things like COVID, then that's a really very much a environmental led, right? For instance, looking at companies that have not ventured into food tech, that have gone into food tech in a very rapid sense, again, because of COVID, or you have vice versa, you either pivot into new business or you have to close down. For example, Gojek, we have a lifestyle services when we used to have these, people that go to people's houses to provide services. That in no way can be done now under the new COVID environment, right? So I think there's a lot of different reasons how the sort of the companies change and evolve, but usually we do see a lot more that consumer-led, and then you're sort of investor-led, and of course then pivoting, but much more being led by the macro economics and some of the challenges ahead.
Cool. Mitchell, I'd like to bring you into the conversation to shed some light on the New Zealand context of businesses. So, as I mentioned earlier, some of the research that we'd done early in this year, when we looked at capability and maturity of New Zealand organizations, even the larger organizations, only 60% of them would claim that they're digital capable. And that was the larger organizations. When you start to look at the SMEs, that number was even more dire. So I guess my provocative question to you is, are we ready? Are New Zealand companies ready?
Very good question. I will bring a combination of my experience, first-hand experience, and also direct observations, because I see a lot of activities between New Zealand and Asia, but also my bias as well. I have a natural bias, and I'll explain that in a sec. So firstly, when I look at the New Zealand businesses who have real opportunities in Asia, and you can probably arguably say, most of our businesses do that. I kind of see them in two lights. One is the one group is the digitally or technologically mature group, and then the other ones is not. And they can be large or small. It doesn't matter. You can have a small New Zealand business that's very highly, digital savvy, and then you have a massive organization who are not. Right. So in that sense, I think the digital savvy businesses from New Zealand have a real opportunity to engage with the digital economy in Asia. But it's really important to be able to recognize that how a typical New Zealand business who's digital savvy, who may even be a digital business, have grown and developed in New Zealand, through innovation and through growing and building a business. When it comes to taking that business into Asia, the dynamics change very quickly, and that dynamics is fundamentally in the realm of I call it collaboration. In New Zealand, you can build your own business and you can grow it and so forth. But when you take that business into Asia, it's going to be so much harder to establish the business and to grow that business on the ground yourself. It's kind of almost common sense, but it's certainly very common to see a number of businesses not really kind of grasping that. There's too much of the strong DIY culture in Kiwi businesses, which are which is a very useful dynamic to have when you're innovating something new, you're inventing something new, or you're creating something from scratch. That DIY culture is really, really important, and we're really good at it, right? It's really so there is a real place for that. But the moment we expand into Asia, that is where we fall. I think to really engage in any kind of market in Asia, you really need to look at how can you partner with businesses in Asia, and I'm still just talking about the digital and tech savvy New Zealand businesses. And when you look at the market in Asia, if you're thinking of taking a business to business innovation from New Zealand into Asia, you kind of have a different path to taking a business to consumer offering into Asia. With business to business, I think New Zealand companies can leverage the very high degree of complexity and how well developed we are in terms of that maturity in processes and intellectual properties and things like that, that we can then share that with the markets in Asia for business to business offering. But when it comes to business to consumer offerings, it's really, really critical that the offering that's taken into Asia is so localized. But more importantly, I think even if you're innovating with a B2 business to consumer offering, it's even important to co-create and co-develop some of those in Asia, because the consumer culture and everything is so different to that of New Zealand, right? Yeah. So those are the kind of couple of key points around digital savvy and tech savvy businesses. Now swinging over to a huge number of Kiwi businesses who are not digital savvy and tech savvy. I'm also wearing a hat with the Digital Council of New Zealand, and the council has been doing some particular work around how SMEs can be empowered through digital connectivity and inclusion and everything else. And it's been interesting to discover the many challenges that stand in the way of, particularly New Zealand small businesses in going digital, right? And if you can't go digital, of course, Asia is just much less accessible. So you got to go digital. But going digital in New Zealand has many barriers. Some examples include, SMEs, small businesses owners are very busy. They don't have time to develop the skill set that they need to go digital. They don't know who to trust to help them to go digital. Some of them are in the older generation, so they fear digital, and they don't have any kind of plans to get around that. If you are a small business and you happen to be based in a rural area, you have less access to internet connectivity than if you were in a city. So, and then also small businesses also have a mental barrier. When you look at e-commerce or digital commerce or public services offered by government, so there's an element of trust. So many small businesses struggle to trust the digital platform that might help them get access to markets in Asia or elsewhere. So there's a whole bunch of challenges there that a lot of Kiwi small to medium companies face before they could even access the digital pathway into Asia. So those are the things that I've seen.
Yeah. So in that context, I mean, we are a small market. Having lived in Singapore and for a long time taking for granted that Australia was in the neighborhood of Asia, so the Asia market needs us. And then you go to a market like Singapore and you see the Kiwis are there, the Aussies are there, the Yanks are there, the Brits are there, the Dutch are there, the Germans are there. What is the point of difference that Kiwi businesses could take into Asian markets? We are a small market. Scaling up is a challenge. The investor appetite might not be as even as comparable to Singapore or other places. What's the low-hanging fruit, I guess?
Assuming this question is still for me.
Yep.
So I would like to highlight a comment from Susan, which is very apt here, which is New Zealand has the advantage of being kind of both, or having the best of both worlds in a way, because on one hand, we are a very sophisticated, mature market in terms of business knowledge and processes, as well as digital and data and capability. On the other hand, at the same time, we care a lot about inclusion, about impact, about sustainability, right? So often, this is just my belief, is that firstly, there is an opportunity to combine both as we innovate, firstly. Secondly, if we do not innovate in a silo, if we co-develop, co-create new products and services for Asian markets with local partners in Asia, right, then by virtue of doing so, we're already in the market by the time the product is ready to go to market. And so I think the fastest way into Asia is with Asians.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yep. Couldn't agree more. I mean, you also did refer to, New Zealand and the digital economy. And many nations aspire to becoming the digital, economy and the digital nation in the region, whether it's in Asia or whether it's in the Asia Pac context. Stephanie, with your work and the work that you've been doing, particularly, engaged with government, looking at trade policy, regulations, legislation, policies, where do you think New Zealand is positioned as far as engaging with Asian counterparts? I mean, I know, I think it was last year, the New Zealand government adopted quite significantly a lot of the policy approaches that the Singaporeans have taken with industry transformation and the like. From a trade policy perspective, legislation, where do you think we are as far as that collaboration and engagement aspect that Mitchell talked about?
Well, thanks, Chris. That's a great question. And in answering it, I'd like to sort of hark back to the question you put to Mitchell as well, which is, what's our special sauce when it comes to this region? And I think I agree with Mitchell. We've got those great values, great products, and all the rest of it. But, looked at it through the lens of a kind of a trade negotiator or trade policy, we've also had to be really nimble and creative in the way we approach things, because we're down the bottom of the South Pacific, miles away from anywhere. So I think we bring a really good mindset to this. And I think it's also important to remember that when you talk about, digital trade, the tendency is to think, oh, well, that's, a software exporter or a sharing platform, something that's really sort of looks very obviously digital. But I think the exciting thing for New Zealand about the digital economy and the potential for digital trade is that it actually touches on every part of our economy. So it's not just the software exporters, it's also, the creative economy, the gamers, the film, the interactive media folk, it's the traditional sectors, agriculture, food and beverage, red meat or dairy products can use platforms, e-commerce, digital logistics, all of these tools essentially to take the cost and distance essentially out of the equation when it comes to trade. And, that inclusion piece that both Susan and Mitchell have talked about for small businesses or remote businesses can, there's this phrase, you can be a sort of a micro multinational, you can have instant global reach, even if you're a sole trader sitting at your kitchen table in rural New Zealand. So, I mean, the potential's enormous. And already in New Zealand, even though, most people in Asia might not think, oh, they're a digital nation. Well, if you look at the technology sector, so sort of high-tech manufacturing as well as digital services and so on, that's already actually our third largest export category. So it's big and it's growing. And even if you're just domestically focused, digital trade has huge value. I mean, there's been a lot of work the Productivity Commission has looked at. What's the impact on productivity? There's clearly a huge one. It brings ideas, capital, talent, all those back office services that used to be a really huge burden for small businesses, cloud computing, and use Xero or MYOB for your accounting services and so on. So there's really fantastic potential there. But if you look at it from the trade policy point of view, unfortunately, we're also starting to see some trade barriers. I mean, that's the story of trade. Unfortunately, the people like me and the fantastic negotiators we have at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade, their life's work is getting at the barriers, and unfortunately the digital economy is no different. And I think in digital, really the technology and the innovative business models have really outstripped what the regulators have done. So there's this process of policymakers kind of scrambling to keep up with what's happening in the technology. And sometimes that means that the regulations are not really fit for purpose, they don't enable innovation, or we can also see a kind of knee-jerk reaction, a kind of conservatism, if you like, to regulate. And it's, without wanting to be sort of rude or critical, sometimes it's not very well grounded in an understanding about the way technology works. So, for example, there's this thing called data localization, where countries essentially require you to keep your data and store your data, process your data in a market. And sometimes that's driven for quite, valid objectives, cybersecurity or privacy. but that doesn't really understand the technology, because the idea that if it's locked up in a server sitting next to your desk, it's going to be somehow safer than if it's, you know, encrypted in the cloud. It doesn't actually work technologically like that. So there's a kind of an education process that's required when it comes to the trade policy or regulatory settings as well. But some of the other barriers are definitely driven by sort of outright economic nationalism or protectionism. We're starting to see lots of restrictions on cross-border data flows, for example, and that's really kind of the lifeblood of digital trade. So the likes of cloud computing and you know, anything where data is going across borders, which applies to most digital trade activities or e-commerce or logistics, whatever it might be. You know, some of those things are restricting what can take place. There are often quite restrictive regulations for some of the innovative technologies like AI or fintech. You know, there's sort of a hesitation about using things like e-payments or digital identities. So there's a lot that's starting to be regulated in a way that's not necessarily very trade friendly, if you like. And that applies whether you're a big business, a small business, you know, whichever sector. So what can we do about it? Well, I'm, you know, proud to say that New Zealand is kind of at the cutting edge of trying to be creative in trade policy in this area, as it has been in so many others. And so it's recently agreed a new trade deal called the DEPA, the Digital Economy Partnership Agreement, with Singapore and Chile, which is really trying to get at the sort of holistic picture for the digital economy and develop kind of responsive trade rules. So it is very much focused on creating the right enabling environment for all of this trade to flow. I mean, cross-border data flows, but also the regulations around things like digital identities or artificial intelligence, you know, governance and ethics framework, building trust that I think Susan and Mitchell have both mentioned, which is really important, not just for consumers and sort of everyday people, but businesses want to trust as well. As Mitchell said, you know, for an SME, they need to feel confident in what they're doing. And you know, some of the things that would really, in a very practical way, take out costs for business. So one great innovation, for instance, is on E-Invoicing, which we've just recently put in place with Australia, and it's also, you know, kind of some work there in the DEPA agreement as well, which will really strip out a lot of kind of day-to-day costs for businesses and mean that small businesses can get paid faster and so on. Really important, especially in the COVID age, where, as others have mentioned, you know, we've seen remote working, using e-commerce, doing business across borders. It really needs the infrastructure and the regulatory environment to work in a sort of enabling way. But of course, the digital economy is really borderless. It's kind of a global economy. Yeah. And so the ideal, I mean, it's fantastic that we're doing innovative work in the Asian region and in the Asia Pacific. So some really exciting stuff that New Zealand is doing in Apec, which we are chairing next year. And I mentioned at the outset, one of the hats that I wear is helping to advise the New Zealand members of a body called the Apec Business Advisory Council, which is the voice of business in Apec. So New Zealand is chairing that next year as well. And we've got this fantastic opportunity working with the likes of Mitchell and the Digital Council and New Zealand businesses to really shape the debate, the conversations, the exploration of the issues in the Asia Pacific region. And, you know, ideally that will be a kind of a pathfinder to a global model as well. So there's also work going on in the World Trade Organization, where New Zealand is very actively engaged. They're called the e-commerce negotiations, but it's much more than just, you know, the likes of platforms, Amazon or Alibaba. It goes well beyond that. But, you know, essentially trying to create an enabling environment for digital trade, not a sort of a permissive or restrictive one that actually enables innovation and you know, gives businesses the chance to really leverage the technology in a way that delivers inclusive and more environmentally friendly outcomes as well. So, I mean, I think there's huge scope there. We just unfortunately can't afford to just look at the domestic economy or domestic challenges that Mitchell mentioned, which are obviously absolutely crucial as well. You know, we need the skills, the infrastructure, the mindset, but we need the global environment to work for digital trade as well.
Yeah, no, there's a lot in there and lots of developments happening with New Zealand on the cutting edge, and that's so true. But I want to stay with this, the deeper arrangement. And I guess the question to Mitchell and Susan on that regard is, how well do small businesses or even larger businesses in New Zealand understand some of these, these developments that are happening in the trade space? So for instance, if you look at, okay, the Singapore and the Chilean partnership, how are businesses responding to that? Do they even, the awareness level, is that high enough for businesses to say this is going to be good? Transaction costs are going to be reduced. Hopefully that means easier access to markets, payments, and all of that. So I guess that question's to you, Mitchell. Susan, how are Kiwi businesses looked at in Singapore, for instance?
Susan, would you like to go first?
Sorry, just let me clarify. The question is how we are viewing.
How are the Kiwi businesses, viewed?
Oh, how are the Kiwi? Yes.
Yeah.
It's a really good question, because I think reflecting on the, what both Stephanie saying and Mitchell saying, I think New Zealand, we're such a small economy when we are sort of being presented outside. When people think about New Zealand businesses, is usually quite small. We're innovative, we're nimble, but we're never the big players, right? But they will say it's awesome to work with Kiwis and to trade, so the challenges, I think New Zealand hasn't yet truly show what's one of like our biggest strength. What are some of the products that we're able to take globally? Even though we're starting seeing some movement with some of the a bit more traditional product base, right? When we look at Xero, which is still considered as a software product base that is coming into Asia. So there is that sort of, I think the interesting dynamic between New Zealand being really nimble, potentially really creative and really innovative, but not yet truly have product that's going global that really speaks to that as well. So I think there's definitely room, but Kiwis are great. We're great network workers. We're around the world, and I think that's going to be a great opportunity to see how we can take that further.
Mitchell, what do you think about the developments with Draper and how are the businesses even aware of these developments? How do we raise the awareness level if they aren't aware?
Again, just my view is that across the businesses that I deal with, there's very, very little awareness. I think there's a significant gap between what our government tries to do and achieves, for strong trade opportunities for New Zealand businesses, and New Zealand businesses really understand what that means and how they can physically leverage that, in a very tangible way. Without, I'm hoping I won't be unpopular by saying this, but I think the government is rather unimaginative in terms of all of these things can help businesses, and the businesses are kind of unimaginative in terms of how they can really get on board and leverage and grow their businesses with these things. And I think that's actually very normal, right? So it just presents an opportunity to close that gap with education, communication, also with involvement. So as New Zealand government works on these trade opportunities, it would be good to involve more businesses of very diverse nature, not just a certain type of business, not just the businesses that are already trading internationally, or not just the businesses that are kind of ready to go to foreign markets, but also businesses that are earlier in their journey, to really understand what's going on. So I think there's one gap there that I think potentially government and industry groups can kind of look at working together to close that gap, because industry groups have extensive reach across their vertical industries, across businesses of all sizes, right? So that's the one thing. The second thing is, I think there's something really important about data that, again, both government, when government works on trade agreements and things, as well as businesses look at how they engage with international markets, and there's a whole bunch of things, but I think the thing that kind of jumped up top of my mind is data ownership. You know, I used two examples, you know, like in Vietnam, you know, the data that the the government collects is about individuals is simply deemed to be owned by the government. In New Zealand, you know, we have this culture that we believe that data about us, when the government collects it, the data belongs to us, right? We have the rights and all those things. So these different cultures, and neither is right or wrong. It's not about right or wrong. It's just about really understanding those differences when we move into, when trade policies connect the two markets, and then when businesses, individual businesses, go into these foreign markets to really understand that, you know. How can I explain that in a tangible example? Well, for example, in New Zealand, you know, when you go to hospitals, they have to share data with your insurance company, you know, who actually then pay for the treatment, right? So there's a data sharing thing going on, and fundamentally, both the insurance company and the hospital understand that the data belongs to the patient. Yeah. In Vietnam, it's not the case, right? The hospital collects the data, deliver the treatment, and send a bill to the insurance company, a very exorbitant bill that's maybe 3 or 4 times the cost. And the insurance company can't really validate that because they cannot get access to the data because there's no understanding around the data belonging to the patient, you know, and the hospital don't have to share that data with the insurance company. So you need to understand those dynamics before you move into the market, you know, and that's the sort of thing that I think both businesses as well as government need to understand.
But I come in there, Chris, if
Sure.
that's okay, just with an observation, which is that I think, I mean, it's always true for trade policy that there needs to be good engagement with the stakeholders, the businesses and civil society. But I think in the case of digital trade or the digital economy, it's even more true because it's actually often the case, particularly in these sort of emerging technologies. I mean, the data point that Mitchell's raised, some very sort of sophisticated ideas there, but also, for instance, in artificial intelligence or some of the issues around the Internet of Things, some of those really, you know, kind of bleeding edge technologies. It's the industry or the practitioners themselves that have a really deep understanding about the implications of some of these things. And I think, you know, it's really an area where business and policymakers should be trying to sort of co-create the regulatory approach there. And I think that's something that New Zealand is doing to some extent, which is fantastic, but we need more of it, you know, to really get good policy. And I think it's also the case that business isn't necessarily, you know, if you use a cliche, business would be opposed to being regulated, government would be mad to regulate, but it's actually not the case. I mean, I think, you know, from businesses that I've talked to in this sector, you know, it's useful to have some guardrails. It's useful to have a set of parameters that help to establish a kind of a social license, if you like, to do business or to trade. Yeah. And, you know, governments and businesses should be working really closely together to develop these approaches and regulations.
Yep, couldn't agree more. We're closing in on time, and I've got a few questions that are coming through in the quick Q&A boxes. So staying with Stephanie and Mitchell, I guess these questions are more for you. I guess in talking about Asia, you can't go too far without talking about China. So there's one question in here which says, I would be very interested in your thoughts on how we navigate between the Asia-led innovation by China versus increasing tensions with US, Europe, especially regarding data privacy, tech, IP. Do we play a Swiss neutral type role? And just in that way, and the other question is around a huge gap between G2G and people-to-people business relationships. And I guess, you know, this is both up your alley, Stephanie and Mitchell. Do you want to take any of those questions? Stephanie, maybe we start with you in terms of looking at, you know, on the back of DEPA. Are we going to build in more coalitions with other countries in the Asian region? What role do we play, particularly when it comes to, you know, the data privacy, IP issues?
Yeah, well, thanks, Chris. I think, you know, that's a really interesting question. I mean, fundamentally, trade is about relationships, it's about people. And, you know, at the level of sort of business to business, as Mitchell talked about, you know, that's absolutely crucial to success. At the level of, you know, kind of policymakers, governments, I mean, I think Apec and the ABAC forum are really important ways to have those conversations, because, you know, it's no mystery that there are some tensions there around basically the underpinning philosophy that's driving a lot of the technology policy. But there's also a really huge area of shared interest, shared kind of technological approaches and so on. And I think there's enormous scope to benefit mutually in those areas, even leaving aside the sort of more sensitive parts. And APEC is the perfect opportunity to have that conversation. But, you know, just specifically on privacy, you know, this is a really crucial question right now, and it's driven by quite valid concerns. I mean, of course, trust is fundamental, and we need a way to ensure that. I think the problem is that some of the approaches that have been developed, for instance, the European GDPR regulation, is a very sort of prescriptive and heavy-handed way to achieve that important goal. And, you know, I think there's scope for a conversation about ways to achieve that don't involve that kind of very sort of prescriptive approach regulation. And, you know, so I think there's a lot that needs to be explored and talked about that can be done in a really, you know, constructive way. But Mitchell, you might have some other insights.
Sure. So I'm not involved directly with I guess, government policy. So I sort of take a slightly a broader view from a business perspective, as well as from an industry perspective. So there are opportunities for industries in New Zealand to connect with industries in Asia, right? And this is kind of below the government level at the top there, and so I can speak at the industry level and as well as the individual business level. So at the industry level, I think there are many opportunities for New Zealand industry to connect and partner with industry, the counterparts in Asia. For example, in 2017, I led the New Zealand fintech industry to join the ASEAN fintech network. We also established a direct relationship with, you know, with InsurTech Asia as well, and a number of other relationships to provide a more direct industry level connection and bridge for members of these industries who are businesses to engage in between these markets. And that really, at the industry level, I haven't seen any political barriers, whilst all these, you know, there are political and security issues and things like going on at the government level, but at the industry level, that seemed to be kind of not immune, but maybe a little bit further away from that. So it's quite easy for industry to connect with each other and establish, you know, how do these two industries work together in between these markets. So that's one example. The other one is at the business level, at the business entrepreneurial level. The fundamental to success in Asia is relationship, right? Not politics. Politics change, politicians change, but the successful businesses that have been around in Asia, what haven't changed is the relationship, very long-term kind of approach to doing business with direct relationship, interpersonal relationship, and I think so for businesses. Whilst we need to pay attention to the geopolitical dynamics, but what will actually help navigate the impact of those things is still at the ground level in between businesses and between business people. And the other thing too is that taking a step back, I think I know Vietnam the best out of Southeast Asia because I spend the most time there, back and forth. But I really like the way Vietnam understands that it is a small nation, and it has this strategic approach to working and dealing with China, with the US, and with Russia. These three super giants, you know, who all have very strong trade ties to Vietnam. You know, and whilst China has had a very long, Vietnam has had a very long history of conflict with China over, you know, 1,500 years or so, they have learned to actually work with that complexity and still develop a very strong trade relationship, right? So we might argue with each other about something, but we're still trading with each other. And they've done that really, really well. And I think being a small nation that we are, it's not about staking a position, but it's more about adapting to what's going on to the trading partners' positions, and wherever we can assist, that's great, you know, and really we need to kind of play with everybody.
Yep. Susan, I've got one last question for you, and then we'll just get a final message from each of the panelists. So one of the questions with your business hat on, Susan, is which areas will most benefit from digital transformation in New Zealand? So I'm not sure if that is focusing on industry or whether that's looking at business functions within organizations. But given that broad question, where do you think the low-hanging fruit might be for New Zealand as far as digital transformation is concerned?
I think that's a really good question. I think if I just reflect back a little bit more on what the sort of Mitchell has touched upon on regarding to relationship, right? I think one of the questions maybe, and again, and from my observations, the Kiwis, we don't usually ask sort of what is the problem you're trying to solve and how can I solve it with you together? So what I'm hearing is sort of, you know, how do we use that relationship to broaden our sort of business network and presence? Is really understand what is the Asia problem that needs to be solved, and use the unique sort of Kiwi talent and solution to solve that, right? So then that comes back to the question, what are some of the opportunities? I actually think there's a huge opportunity from the education space. So if I look at the growth of the emerging Asia, one of the things that we really want to close the gap is from the educational perspective. And actually a lot of the education, so edu-tech point of view, is how do we start thinking about capability build beyond the much more institutionalized way of engagement, right? I think there's a great opportunity for New Zealand to actually think about what are the problems that Asia is trying to solve from an education perspective, and really bring in some of the unique insight. And again, I'm a little bit biased because I'm sort of in the talent leadership space, and I'm seeing this huge gap. I have constantly wanted to hire sort of great Kiwis to come out to Asia and work and experience Asia from Asia, right? Reading about Asia from New Zealand, or even in Singapore, you know, such a mature market. It's not the same as being in emerging Asia, working in Vietnam, like what Mitchell have said, you know, working in Indonesia, and so on and so forth. So I think there's a great opportunity. But if I summarize, I think there's a great opportunity for Kiwis to think about what is a problem I can help Asia solve, and really come together, solve these problems together, and build a kind of relationship, rather from a very product oriented way, which is we Kiwi have developed a product and let's try to sell it and see how we can expand that globally. Yep.
So eventually it comes down to the whole notion of relationship building. No matter how much digital transformation takes place globally, at the end of the day, I think, as Mitchell and Stephanie alluded to, it's about those people-to-people relationships. Stephanie and Mitchell, you've got the last word as far as what's the call to action. We've got over 50 in the audience still hanging around listening to us. What's the takeaway message for them?
Okay, I'll save Stephanie to last, you know, the best to last, of course. So I'll just jump in for now. I think the key message from me is that, you know, for Kiwi businesses to really expand into Asia, whether or not it's digital or traditional business, the key thing is to really look to partner, you know, to really leverage, to build and leverage relationship, and to partner, and rather than going alone or DIY.
Stephanie.
Thanks, Chris. And thanks, Mitchell and Susan. It's been a great conversation. I guess the thought I would leave people with is, well, modern trade needs modern trade rules. And we need business to help co-create those with the policymakers, with the officials. So I guess, you know, I would just encourage people who are listening to get in touch with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade and talk about what's in the deeper and how to build on that. And, you know, for those who are interested in the Asia Pacific in particular, please get in touch with me or others from the Apec Business Advisory Council, which you can reach through the TradeWorks website, because we would love to have your inputs, your ideas, your concerns about digital trade in Asia, and see what we can do to shape the agenda so that we can really leverage the best of the digital age, especially, you know, in this time of COVID. It's there waiting for us. We should be making use of it.
Fantastic, Stephanie. I think it's pretty clear there's still lots more work to be done, and we need all hands on deck if we have to carve out a niche for us and for Kiwi businesses in the Asia Pacific. So thank you very much, Susan, Chen, Mitchell, Pham, Stephanie Honey, for being excellent panelists tonight. Thank you to Simon Draper and Alistair Crozier from Asia New Zealand Foundation for helping us put this together. From the UC Business School, again, thanks to all who've been in the audience and the panelists as well. It's time for me and for us to sign out. So tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Thank you.